parents convinced my husband that he deserved better, and they all left me when I couldn't give them grandkids. 3 years later, they were shocked when they saw me with a baby girl. So I 30F recently bumped into my parents and my ex-husband Scott. 33 AM, and I really don't know how to feel about that meeting. For context, my parents and I have not been on speaking terms for almost 3 years, and it's the same with my ex-husband. We got divorced 3 years back, and since then we haven't been in touch. In fact, I've done everything in my power to make sure that I don't have to see them again, because they pretty much ruined my life and mental health back when I was still with them, to the extent that I felt like I didn't even deserve to exist. After my divorce, I moved to the suburbs and tried to build a separate life for myself, away from everyone and everything attached to my past. So running into them recently has been a huge shock for me. And I kind of said certain things to them that I'm not sure was the best move for me. My parents had always wanted a son, and it's not like they treated me badly growing up, but it was very obvious to me that they would have treated me differently if I had been a boy. My mother had even spoken about it on several occasions, and I had tried my best to be the son that they never had, but I couldn't succeed. After one graduated from college and started living separately, I still tried to stay in touch with my parents because no matter what, they were still my family. And they were the only family that I had. Because I wasn't particularly close to my grandparents, and neither did I have any uncles or aunts who would be there for me. So I had accepted my fate that no matter how much they pushed me away, they were still my only family. And even if they did not seem very interested in keeping in touch with me, I still tried to maintain contact. Then when I was around 23 years old, I started dating Scott. We had met at a concert and had an instant spark. So after dating for 6 months, I introduced him to my parents. And that's when my parents started putting in more of an effort to keep in touch with me. They would call me more often and ask me about my relationship, and basically expressed more of an interest in my life. And I had noticed this change. But because it was a welcome change, I did not think much of it and just accepted it. The longer I dated Scott, the more involved my parents became in my life. And after one point, it felt like we were all just one big happy family. I was quite happy about it because this was all I had ever wanted. I did not question it, even though I really should have anyway. After a little over 2 years of dating, we got engaged, and then we got married after having spent 3 years together. After we got married, things were pretty great for a while, and I was enjoying my life as a newlywed. But 6 months after my wedding, my parents started hinting that they wanted a grandchild. I was just 26 at the time, and I wasn't exactly ready. I wanted to wait for a couple of more years before I started trying for a baby. But at their insistence, I had to talk with Scott, and he was all for the idea of starting a family. So because of his enthusiasm, we decided to start trying for a baby soon after we got married. We tried for a really long time, but even after several months had passed, we had not been successful in conceiving. We started to suspect that maybe something was not right and decided to get tested, and unfortunately, it turned out that I was infertile. It came as a huge shock to both of us, but more than us, it was my parents who were disappointed. And they had not even bothered to hide it. The day that we announced it to both our parents, my dad actually walked out afterward instead of comforting me. We decided to stop trying for a while, and Scott and I had a discussion about trying other ways like IVF, but that would cost us a lot, and success during our first attempt was not even guaranteed. So we had to put our plans of starting a family on hold for a while until we had made more money and would be able to afford several rounds of IVF. We were content with that, even though we were a bit upset, but my parents were extremely unhappy. They stopped visiting, they stopped talking to me. And no matter how much I tried to explain to them that this was not exactly my fault, they were just not ready to hear it. After a few weeks had passed, I felt so let down by their behavior that I called them up and gave them a piece of my mind. I told them that they had been treating me a little too cruelly just because I couldn't give them a grandchild right now. And that made me doubt whether they were even capable of being good grandparents when I would actually be able to have a kid. I told them that they had treated me hard all my life just because I was not a guy. And I could see how differently they treated my husband. For a really long time, I had tried to ignore all of that and maintain our relationship. But now I was not interested in keeping in touch with them anymore, and I would appreciate it if they stayed away from me forever. It was very hard for me to do that because for a really long time I wanted nothing but their approval. But now I realize that it was next to impossible. But instead of being sorry about it, they decided to double down on what they were doing, and they were fine with me not speaking to them again because I was worthless as a woman anyway. Since I couldn't have kids and they wanted nothing to do with me, it hurt to hear them say it, but at least I knew where I stood with them. After that phone call, I didn't really speak to my parents and we were done. When I told Scott about that phone call, He was very empathetic at first, but after a few days, I started noticing that even his behavior towards me was changing. I ignored it at first because I was already going through a really tough time mentally. I didn't want to admit to myself that maybe even my husband was going to leave me. So I started pretending that nothing was happening and everything was fine, but within a few months, he had turned into a completely different person and was really cold to me all the time. I tried my best to save our relationship by putting in all the effort that I could, but it did not help because after 3 months, he showed up at home with divorce papers and said that he was done with me. I couldn't say that I was shocked, but I still tried to reason with him, and I told him that we could always try for a baby later. But he told me that there were a lot of presents that he wanted to leave and he just didn't want to get into it. He wanted this to be over as soon as possible because it was difficult for both of us. The divorce took almost 7 months to be finalized, and those were the toughest of my life so far. I was completely on my own and I had really broken down. To make matters worse, a couple of weeks after he told me that he wanted a divorce and had moved out, I found out from a few relatives that Scott was apparently living with my parents. I knew that talking to them for help, so I decided to talk to my in-laws about it. It was a very uncomfortable conversation, but they said that my parents had apparently been in touch with Scott for the past few months, and I guess they had been brainwashing him into leaving me, or something, which is why Scott had decided to leave. Even though my in-laws did not think it was a good idea, but he had fought with them and wasn't speaking to them anymore. I don't know the specifics of what they had told Scott, but I remember my in-laws telling me that Scott had implied that my own parents had said that he deserved better. So I'm still not sure of what exactly they had told him, but I guess they were just desperate to have a son in any way whatsoever, and since I wasn't speaking to them anymore, neither could they hope for a grandchild for me. And soon, they decided to take Scott under their wing and got him to leave me. So I was left pretty broken after my divorce, and it took me several months to get back on my feet, but I was able to do it since then. I have not looked back and have done everything in my power to forget about the past and move on after the divorce. I moved out of my house into the suburbs. I got a new job, changed my look and everything, and blocked my parents and Scott on social media. I also told all of my old friends and relatives that I did not want to hear anything ever about again, and neither did I want to get them to know anything about me. All of them just respected that. And for the past 3 years, I've been in therapy and I've been living pretty well. The only thing that had been bothering me was the absence of a baby, because even though I did not have a husband or parents anymore, I still wanted a child. I felt like I was ready to be a mother. In last year, I started IVF treatments and got pregnant with the help of an anonymous owner. And 4 months ago, I gave birth to my baby girl. Life has been pretty great since she was born, and I'm really happy about 4 days ago. I had been strolling down the street with her, which is when I bumped into my parents and Scott. I was really shocked to see them on my street, and at first I thought that they were here to see me, but I realized that they were walking out of a house a couple of blocks away when they spotted me. I literally froze and I should have gone back home, but I just didn't have it in me to move. So they walked over to me and greeted me, and then immediately asked about the baby, because to their knowledge, I was infertile. I responded to them with the truth. And by then, I had processed what was happening and was starting to walk back home. But Scott stopped me and said that he was really glad that he had bumped into me, because he had been thinking about me a lot recently. Apparently they had come here to visit his aunt, who had recently moved into this neighborhood, and he thought that bumping into me was a sign from the universe that he should make things right with me again and give our relationship a second chance. My parents were also standing right there, and they insisted that I invite them home, and we have a chat about everything that's been going on in my life. Since they have clearly missed out on a lot, I was honestly appalled that they were even saying any of this, and actually thought that I was going to invite them after all that had happened in the past. It had taken me 3 whole years to move on from it, and I'm still in therapy trying to work on my feelings. So I kind of had a bit of an outburst, and I told them that I would rather invite a bunch of bloodthirsty wild animals into my house than them, because they would still be better. I told them to cut the crap and stop pretending like they actually cared about me or what was going on with me, because the only reason they wanted to speak to me was because I now had a baby. My parents wanted to speak to me because they were finally going to get a grandkid, and Scott wanted to talk to me because obviously he hadn't been able to find anyone else. He thought that since I had been able to get pregnant once, getting pregnant again would not be a problem, and he could just waltz back into my life again. It was sickening that all they saw me as was a source of babies and not a real person with real feelings. They had all abandoned me when I needed them the most to support me emotionally, even though I had expected it from my parents, because they had already made it very clear right from my childhood that they would much rather prefer a boy. And in their opinion, the only value that a woman had was defined by whether she was capable of being a mother or not. But the real shocker had been Scott, who had spent so many years with me and even comforted me. But in spite of all of that, he had gone along with whatever my parents had said for some twisted reason and left me when I was at my lowest. I hadn't forgotten any of the things that they had said to me, and I just repeated it back to them. So since I was worthless as a woman and since Scott deserved better, maybe they should leave me alone now. And honestly, I've always been a very quiet and shy person. But when they confronted me in the street that day, I've been yelling at them at the top of my lungs. It was 3 years worth of anger coming out all at once, so it had been pretty nasty. And once I was done yelling at them, I made a run for it back to my house and shut the door as quickly as I had been feeling extremely sick after that. So I decided not to go to work for a couple of days and have been staying at home with my baby since then. And my interaction with my parents and Scott have been playing in my head on a loop. Since then, I honestly had no idea what I was going to do about it. Until last evening when I received a call from an unknown number. I don't know why. I usually don't answer calls from numbers that are not known to me, but yesterday I decided to pick up the phone. It was Scott on the other hand, and behind him I could hear my parents whispering in the background. I'm pretty sure they were not even trying to be quiet. They actually wanted me to know that they were there anyway. I tried not to let myself be too affected by that. I just told him that I wanted him not to call me again because otherwise I would be forced to take precautionary steps against him, and I did not want to do that. I told him that the same thing went for my parents as well. I did not want anything to do with them, and the only reason I had even picked up was because I wanted them to know that I was done. I had been done 3 years back as well, and I'm still going to be sticking to it. But Scott told me to hear him out, and in spite of myself, I couldn't hang up. So I let him speak, and he told me that he knew that he had messed up and had my parents. But it was just coming from a place of disappointment. He told me that both my parents, and even he himself, had really been looking forward to starting a family, having a baby in the family and whatnot. Finding out that I was infertile, and wasn't even willing to go through IVF until we had enough money. It was difficult to come to terms with it for them. And they hadn't dealt with the best way possible. But now they really wanted me to give them a second chance to prove that they were worthy of being a part of my life. And after a few seconds, I told them that I did not buy any of the nonsense that they were trying to sell me. They wouldn't have cared about me if they hadn't seen me with a baby that day. And that was the bottom line. That was the truth of the matter. And I was sick of them trying to pretend that it wasn't. And then I was about to hang up. But my parents piped up from the back and said that this was the exact kind of behavior that they had cut me off for. Apparently they believed that I had been very selfish and was thinking about myself when I found out that I was infertile. So instead of giving everybody their space, I kept forcing my presence onto them and kept trying to get them to comfort me and pay attention to me all the time, even though they were struggling with the news themselves as well. And that's why everyone had ended up pushing me away, which is how I ended up in the position of having no one there for me. I did not entertain the conversation after that. I just hung up, and I really do know that they were just trying to gaslight me, but I can't help but doubt myself now. So just for my own peace of mind, I need to ask either because I asked for reassurance after I found out that I was infertile. And it's so first of all, a lot of people wanted to know why my parents had not tried for another baby after I was born if they wanted a boy so badly. Well, my mother had to deal with a lot of complications during her first pregnancy as well, and the doctors had suggested waiting for a couple of years before they tried for another one. But even when she had me, she was in her mid-30s. Waiting for a few more years would mean that she had to wait until her late 30s, which would mean that the pregnancy would be even more risky. Just like I had to struggle a lot to conceive and eventually found out that I was infertile, my mother also had to struggle a lot to conceive me. The only catch was that when she was struggling, it was her mother-in-law who was nasty to her. But this time with me, it was my own mother who couldn't spare a thought about me anyway. That was the reason why they could not have another child. And we're stuck with just me, a daughter, and I don't really know exactly what kind of relationship Scott had with his parents, but from whatever I had observed, they seem to get along pretty well as of now. I don't know if they have been able to make up after the last fallout that they had since. I haven't kept in touch with his parents, and I obviously haven't spoken to Scott about it. But Scott is an only child. He definitely did not have any competition. And whenever I visited his parents, I could see that they really loved him and he had been treated well from his childhood. So I really have no idea why he latched on my parents like he did. At least with my parents, I knew that they wanted us on, which is why they started treating Scott like that. But with him, I had no idea what went wrong. In the past 3 years, I'd only been trying to forget about all of this, so I hadn't really thought about it or questioned it. But now that you guys bring it up, I feel like I have to speak to my ex-in-laws and get to the bottom of it, for my curiosity if nothing else. Anyway, I hope this clears up any doubts that people have. Update 1. I decided to speak to my ex-in-laws and get to the bottom of why exactly Scott has been behaving the way that he has. Honestly, I couldn't think of a single reason why he would need to visit his aunt with my parents. That was just strange. And I already knew that this was not my fault. They had abandoned me when I needed them because they are terrible people. And I knew that they were just trying to gaslight me. I only wanted some reassurance, and I did not want to bother my friends with this, since it's too personal, and that's why I posted it here. So thank you so much to everyone who reassured me, and made sure that I knew that I was not the bad guy here. Anyway, it was quite awkward to reach out to them after 3 years of having no contact, because the last time that I had spoken to them was around the time of the divorce. But luckily, they were quite glad to hear from me. And after a bit of small talk, I decided to get to the point and ask them why exactly Scott was so close to my parents and if they had been in touch with him or not. They told me that a couple of months after their last fight, they had actually been able to make things up and were in touch with him right now. But he had also remained in touch with my parents. They told me that he had been loved as a kid, so it was not like he was trying to replace his parents with mine. But apparently my parents have been pretty shady. And right from the beginning of our relationship, they would try to get him on their side. Even while we were dating, Scott would tell his parents that my parents would occasionally invite him to dinner, even when I was busy, and he would be there for them separately. He thought that this was something worth bragging about, because he believed that he had impressed my parents simply by being himself, which was kind of true because he was a guy, and that was enough to impress my parents. So they had already spent a lot of one-on-one time without my knowledge, and he had started looking up at them as parental figures, even though he had parents of his own and he respected them as well. It was just really complicated. And on top of that, my parents constantly showered him with really expensive stuff and would write him checks all the time. That's the money that Scott had offered to use for IVF back when we were together. But I thought he was bluffing, because back then we did not have that sort of money. And never did I want him to do anything shady for the money. And he didn't want to tell me that he had received a bunch of money from my parents, because then he would have to come clean to me about the kind of relationship that he had with them. But even after that, I refused to get IVF because I didn't think that he had the money I wanted to save. And that's what my parents used to manipulate him into going against me and saying that he deserved better. Somebody who had faith in him. Eventually, in a couple of months, they were able to brainwash him, which is how he ended up leaving me. My ex-in-law apologized to me for it, but also explained that even though they did not agree with the kind of relationship that Scott had with my parents, he was their only son, so they couldn't cut him off either. And I don't blame them, they don't know this to me. And they were just being nice by telling the truth. But anyway, now that I know what the truth is, I don't have any reason to entertain them if they reach out to me. They're all disgusting people and not worth my time. Update 2. I finally decided to go back to work after almost taking 2 weeks off. Luckily, I have quite a lot of days left over for my maternity leave, since I didn't take the full 6 months off in one go, and my company's policy is quite flexible. It was just my daughter and her nanny at home, and I trust the woman implicitly. She has a bunch of references, and I know her personally as well. She's a really good woman. So halfway into the workday, when I received a phone call from her, and she immediately told me that she had decided to take my daughter home with her, since she wasn't sure if staying in my house would be safe or not. Because of my ex-husband, I decided to let her go home with my daughter so they would be safe, and immediately called the cops while driving back home myself. On the phone, she had already informed me that Scott had been standing outside for a couple of minutes and had been screaming for me to come out. And when he realized that I was not in there, he started trying to kick the door down. He was cursing really loudly, and my daughter had been crying. So she had done some quick thinking and had called me so I could inform the police, and she could leave through the back door and walk to her house through the gate in the backyard, since she lived a couple of minutes away. And while I dealt with my ex-husband and the cops, at least my baby would be safe and sound, honestly. Kudos to her, because her top priority was my child's safety and well-being, and that's how it should be anyway. Once I got home, the cop had already arrived, and it was very obvious to me that Scott had been drinking. It was weird because it was just around 12 in the afternoon, and that was no time to be drunk. But there he was. I decided to press charges against him because he had really pissed me off, and I wanted him out also. This would give me an excuse to get a restraining order against him because he was clearly losing his marbles anyway. They were able to take him away at a couple of minutes later. My nanny came back home with my daughter, and I gave her the rest of the day because I was going to stay home with my daughter. I guess I'm gonna have to take a couple more days off from work, but I'm not really complaining since I get to spend it with my favorite person. Update 3. Hey! So it's been a couple of weeks since I last posted here. I got really busy with taking care of my baby, and I also just decided to take on a new project. It's been pretty exciting, but here's the situation with my parents and Scott. So I was able to get the restraining order against Scott. Thankfully, it was not much of a struggle, because I had security footage from the day that he visited me while drunk and started throwing a fit when he discovered that I was not at home. I guess my parents took a look at the situation and decided not to bother me, so they have been staying away. But my ex-in-laws informed me that after what happened they have decided not to keep in touch with Scott. He had apparently been having a hard time finding other women, even though he really wanted to start a family. He can't do that without a partner, and he doesn't like the idea of adopting. So maybe that explains why he was acting out the other day. But it doesn't mean I have to forgive him, especially not after whatever he has put me through. And that includes my parents as well. That doesn't mean that they have shut up about the situation though. They are very much still trying to badmouth me to my relatives. And it's just sad because it's really not working. Everyone knows that. They were the ones who did the worst thing possible to me. And now they are trying to pretend like they are the victims here. That's not how it works, and they had to learn the hard way anyway. I'm glad that they are never going to be able to have any contact with their grandchild. I'm just not gonna allow it. My daughter and I are going to lead a wonderful life together without anyone bothering us. And I'm definitely going to be a much better parent than the ones that I had as an example.